Hi, this is Dungeon Master Mitch.
And this is Dungeon Master Ian.
We wanted to take a quick second and tell you a little bit about our Patreon page.
We have been working hard to bring you some awesome content with our Block Party Podcast Network shows, and we couldn't do it without your support over at Patreon.
We have made a lot of changes over at our Patreon page, trying to bring you the best rewards and set the best stretch goals that we can.
If you want to check out more, head on over to Patreon and search Block Party Podcast Network.
Thank you so much for just listening to our shows and supporting us in that way. We wouldn't be where we are today without you. And now, enjoy the show. Well, welcome back to the Dungeon Master's Block, the place where we come to talk about the Dungeon Master, the most important person in the game, the only person capable of playing God, killing characters, and lowering the egos of all other people at the table. I am one of your hosts, Dungeon Master Mitch.
And I'm Dungeon Master Neal, aka Joke Maniac.
And today we have a really special guest. We're excited. We have Greg Tito, the communications manager of Dungeons and Dragons at Wizards of the Coast and host of Dragon Talk and official Dungeons and Dragons podcast here with us. And what are we going to be talking about, Neil?
We are going to be talking about one world, multiple impacts. Essentially, you have your campaign world that you're running. You made it yourself. You're running one that you bought off the shelf. Those rhymed, and now I don't like that I said it. But you have multiple groups running. What are the challenges and what are the rewards from doing something like that, taking on that task? And
they're impacting each other. It's essentially they are PCs living in the same world, and they can impact each other and maybe even meet up. And that's definitely something we'll talk about. But before we do start talking about that and getting into the meat, Neil, we have some 5-star reviews.
Yes, and they're from America's Hat, Canada. So for our first one, it is from Amsdale, and it's titled My DM Mecca, the best fantasy debate podcast. I'm a DM, or was. I had a group of friends I played with in high school, but come college, we went our separate ways. It happens, yeah. But I kept building my D&D world to the point I'm at now about 10 years later. My world, Teri, is a living world with continents, kingdoms, and stories. So I decided to write a fantasy story out of it. Your podcast touches on so many aspects of fantasy and D&D from the point of view of every class, creature, hero, and enemy. Keep it up, guys. It's great. Also, I have Joke Maniac stuck in my head. What's the deal with that name? It's Jote, like J-O-A-T.
Oh gosh, you're Joke Maniac from now on. It's sticking.
No.
AKA Joke Maniac. Our next one comes from Churter, and it is entitled Great for New DMs. I'm a new DM, and I find the ideas these guys cover to be extremely helpful in perfecting my DM technique. So, thank you so much for those reviews, Amsdale and Churter.
Yes, thank you.
We super appreciate it.
And with that, let's head to the meat.
I'm starving. We ain't had nothing but maggoty bread for 3 stinking days.
Why can't we have some meats?
The flat meat's back on the menu, boys.
So for the meat today, we have a special guest. We have Greg Tito, communications manager for D&D at Wizards of the Coast and host on Dragon Talk, an official Dungeons and Dragons podcast. Greg, welcome so much to the show.
Oh, thank you, sir. I'm excited to be here and talk to you guys about dungeon mastering.
Yes, we are excited to have you.
I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about yourself. Obviously applicable stuff like, D&D, but whatever strikes your mood, you can say your favorite food. Nothing. I'm not stopping you on any topic you want to share right now.
I grew up in a small fishing village in the coast of Norway. And I remember
perfect.
when I was 6, I caught my first fish. No,
you really had me with that story. I want to hear that. Keep going.
Dungeon mastering is all about improvisation, man. I am one of those people who came into D&D later in life. I guess that's kind of a interesting biographical detail. I loved it when I was a kid. My brothers had I think it was the Dungeon Master's Guide on his shelf. And I remember being like, in fifth grade or fourth grade, going through his bookshelf. I'd already pilfered Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and read that and didn't understand half the jokes, but it didn't matter because it was, I felt cool. Was already starting to devour The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. And then I found this book and I was like, whoa, what is this? And I popped it open and it just spoke to me on so many levels. All the fantasy and sci-fi stuff that I'd been, interested in. This was a way to embody that. I also came in a very Catholic background, so whenever I tried to bring up that I wanted to play this game, it was frowned upon. Not so much like, I got, punished or anything for it, but it was definitely hard to do to kind of create any kind of, campaign or anything like that. So what I did, I just made a lot of characters and kind of, just filed those away in my brain. I don't even know if those still exist, but so I never got to play. There was a couple of starts and stops. I tried to do a Middle Earth role-playing game session in high school. College, we tried to do something, but my friends were never really those friends. We had a lot of shared interests. We played a lot of video games together, but for some reason I couldn't convince them to do D&D. And then I got to my adult life, and I moved to New York City, and I got married, and I was looking around, and I was like, wait a second, I can actually play Dungeons and Dragons now. There's nothing stopping me. I'm an adult. So I got again a few starts and stops there in New York City. Of course, you'd think there'd be like tons of role players there, and there are, but there's also a lot of ones that may not mesh with your specific play style. So I tried out a few. Eventually, found one group. I really latched onto. We were playing the Age of Worms campaign, which was one of Paizo's first adventure paths that they were doing in Dungeon Magazine. We really loved that because I had this great connection to old Greyhawk mythology. Some of the stuff that I didn't know about because I was not as I said, I loved that one specific book, but I didn't follow along with the mythology of Dungeons and Dragons very much, just because I didn't have access to it. So it was cool to have that Dungeon Master who was really into the story and the lore of Greyhawk specifically, and impart that to the players, me especially. So that was really fun. We played that for like 2 or 3 years, a long-standing 3.5 campaign. Got my half-elf ranger up to level 22, I think, by the end. So that's definitely one of my longest played characters. I also got to stress out the system of 3.5 a lot there. I remember my ranger had 6 attacks per turn, I believe, which got very hard to add. So
oh yeah, so much math, those epic levels.
I know, and you're like, there's so many conditional modifiers and stuff because 3.5 is all about the different feats and stuff that you could build on there. So there was, I had an extra D6 of damage against undead and 2d6 of fire I could if this, So I built a dice roller or damage roller essentially in Excel. It's the most programming I've ever done in an Excel spreadsheet. And it was all for the, probably put like a good 16 to 20 hours in building this just so I could hit a button and be like, all right, I did, 95 points of damage.
DM's best friend right there.
Yeah. At first he was a little distrustful because he's not, I wouldn't say he's a Luddite, but he was a little bit like, what? How's this going to work? But he eventually loved the fact that it sped up the game, and it wasn't like, what's 10 plus, the whole time.
I love like lower levels. Like I like it about up until like level 10. And that's one thing I like about 5th edition is it's definitely gotten a lot less crazy with all of that.
Yeah.
But I remember playing those epic games with like my players in 3.5, and they loved those epic levels. So whenever they were rolling those dice and doing math, I'd like to just get up from behind like my screen and just go like right behind them and get close and be like, are you having fun right now? Are you having fun doing math? This is why I like lower levels.
Right. Is this the best part of the game, really?
Yes. Yeah. Should I take a 5-minute break while you
add that up and then tell me how you kill my monster? Yeah, exactly.
That's awesome that you created a whole Excel sheet though to speed up the game.
Yeah.
That's very inventive. So one of the things that you do for Wizards, for D&D at Wizards, is you run Dragon Talk, one of the official Dungeons & Dragons podcasts. Can you tell us, our listeners, who most of them have probably listened to your show, but if anybody out there hasn't, tell us a little bit about Dragon Talk.
Sure. It is, I call it an official podcast, but it was the official for a while because we split it up into Dungeon Delve. And it was, the podcast was, I don't want to disparage the work that had come before that I came on here about a year and a half ago, but it was a little bit of like an afterthought. It was like, oh, hey, we want to, we had these live play sessions that we did with Penny Arcade, back in 2008. And those were great and kind of spawned the whole, Acquisitions Incorporated idea and got a lot of new people playing Dungeons and Dragons. And then fast forward a few years, and that all that live play had shifted to video, and during the PAX West and PAX East games. And so at the time, it was just called the official Dungeons & Dragons podcast, kind of morphed into Mike Merles and Jeremy Crawford talking about the rules at one point. There was a little bit during the D&D Next playtest. There was a lot of discussion about, what rules were in, what were out, and their decision-making process. And that was really cool to get that insight into the process. And then Shelley Mazzanoble, my colleague, and Bart Carroll, who was my colleague and is now my colleague again, shifted it to more of an interview-focused thing. When I came on, I really loved that idea to have people talking about their love of Dungeons & Dragons and trying to shift it to more of like a guest, almost talk show focus. And we got great feedback from that, and it was interesting that people who you'd recognize outside of the D&D world were excited to talk about it and come on the podcast. So we had Rainn Wilson, we had a few comedians who write for major late night shows come on, a few rock musicians. We just talked to Ben Queller and Chris Funk from the Decemberists, not together but separately. So it was kind of like this melding of like, Dan Harmon they talked to as well. So just people who you wouldn't normally think of associated with Dungeons & Dragons were happy to come on and talk about it. And so it really became a celebration of D&D fandom in a way. Then about a couple months ago, we added a segment called Lore You Should Know, more to get a little bit more of the hardcore lore out there about Dungeons & Dragons. Because as I said when I was talking about my biography, not everybody is completely versed in Forgotten Realms lore. Like, you play Dungeons & Dragons, most people do homebrew, or their Dungeon Master puts in a few details from Dungeons & Dragons official publications, but nobody has like a huge holistic view of what's happening in the world except for the people in this office. And I really wanted to like get some of that out through conversation. I'd also been listening to a podcast called Stuff You Should Know, in which they kind of have like a breezy conversational tone while discussing some really interesting pieces of history or things that are happening now in the world. So I like that. So I set up kind of a weekly session talking with Chris Perkins and Matt Cernett here in the office just about the Forgotten Realms and what makes it cool. And I've learned a lot just from doing that segment, and I hope listeners have too. So we're always thinking about new ways to communicate with fans and get more excitement about not only playing Dungeons and Dragons, but learning about what makes it great, and the lore is a big part of that for me.
As listeners, I think we've all seen like the energy that's really been recently just put into the show. And I know that just those different segments and those guest focuses, they've definitely just brought, not like you said, disparaging on what it was before, but it's brought like new life to it. And it's been awesome.
Cool. Thanks, man. Yeah. And we're trying to get it out on as many platforms as possible and trying to make it more of a bigger thing than it was. And also just going to a weekly format shifted things a lot too. I think it used to be, bi-monthly or and the idea of having a new piece of audio to listen to every week has really contributed to it as well. So
the other question we have for you is what first got you interested in DMing, kind of coming across the screen, as it were?
That's a good question. Because as I said, I played in a long campaign for a while and it did some dabbling in DMing, but was never successful. It was honestly, I went to a new place. I moved to North Carolina, and there were a few people who played and were running games, but I wanted to involve new people who may not know about it or expressed interest in Dungeons & Dragons but didn't want to play in the specific style that the preeminent DMs of that kind of social group were playing. So the Dungeon Master was strict in his rule interpretation and would cause a lot of player deaths, reveled in people dying a lot. And they were like, I don't want to do that. I want to get more into the story and have more of a swashbuckling adventure type thing. I'm like, oh yeah, well I can do that. And that's actually the style that I like. Sometimes the hard mode DM too, but I also really like that. So this is actually a good segue into our other thing. But I put out a call. This was when I was at the Escapist. So it was an office in Durham, North Carolina, and there was about 20 to 30 people there. So not a big office by any means. And I put out a call over like email and be like, hey, who wants to play at the time? Let's play 4th edition. Like, who wants to play Dungeons and Dragons? And I think I got 15 people who said they wanted to play in a lunchtime campaign. That's way too much for one group.
That's a lot.
So I didn't expect that much interest. So maybe we'll do two. Maybe we'll do 2 groups. And honestly, that was my first kind of foray into a long-standing campaign where I was dungeon mastering. And then once I did that, I fell in love with it. I loved always having to be on your toes, always being called upon to make decisions. I love playing a lot of board games. I love, when I was a kid, I played Axis and Allies a lot. That's a really fun game, but if you have 5 people playing, there's a lot of downtime. There's a lot of stuff you're waiting for your turn. And Dungeons and Dragons isn't necessarily like that, but it can be. It can feel definitely like, especially in combat, that you're like, oh, I'm just waiting for my spotlight as a player. I was definitely always more of an instigator type player. Like, I always wanted to be doing something. I always wanted to keep stuff going. And so as a player, I would sometimes get frustrated that people would choose to do different things or would take a lot of time. And I would, I just wanted the game to move forward. But as a dungeon master, that's your job, is to instigate and move things forward and always continue to make sure everyone is having fun and enjoying what's happening. So I just think my personality type and my play style fits most with being a DM. And I still like to play. I still like to, take the focus off me and do weird, crazy characters as well. But I think that dungeon mastering just kind of suits my love of the game a little bit more.
Well, Greg, we have, as we do with all of our guests, to wrap this interview segment up, we have a surprise question for you.
Surprise question.
So this surprise question comes from one of our Patreon dragons. His name is, well, at least on the forums, his name is Frotastic, and he is a gold dragon. And his question is to you, and I love the way he states this. What celebrities would you like to play D&D with? And why is it Nathan Fillion?
Oh man, I would love to play with Nathan Fillion. I think he is one of those actors that I feel like plays himself.
Right.
And I don't mean that in a bad way. I just feel like
no, not at all.
He's so good at being that like lovable scoundrel that I would. Yeah, you're right. I would totally love to play with him. He would. Maybe I would make him play against type. Like, okay, now you have to be be a Bible thumping paladin. Go for it. Yeah, that would be tons of fun. David Duchovny is another one that comes to mind. I love him on X-Files and a couple of his other roles. But have you ever seen him on like talk shows or something like that?
I don't think so.
He's got the driest wit, and it slays me every single time. So I would love to just kind of
bring that dry wit into a game of yours.
Exactly, and be like, all right, now you're going to play the 5th edition bard who has like all of those awesome vicious mockery cantrips, and like make sure he has to do insults every single time he does that in character. Deborah Ann Wall is probably another one that I would love to play with. She's in Daredevil. She was in True Blood. And I recently found out that she loves dungeon mastering, actually. Like, she played D&D for a long time, and then now she's... I listened to a podcast that she did with her boyfriend, and then it was funny how the roles were reversed. She is really into Dungeons and Dragons, and the boyfriend is not. And so he was like... It sounded like indulging her and having her talk about what made her campaign cool, and I just love that. And I thought that I love her as an actress, and I thought that the way she approached the creativity of developing her campaign would be awesome. So yeah, I would love to play with her, and I also really like Aisha Tyler. I know her the most from hosting the Ubisoft press conferences during E3, probably, which sounds crazy, but she's been in a couple of other roles and is a great host. But she cracks me up in the way that she can control a room of rabid gamers while also not feeling false at all. Like, she actually, I can tell that she has a love of all games. And I've heard through the grapevine that she has played Dungeons and Dragons too. So I would love to insert her into the group and see how that all gets mixed up. But that was a cool question. Thank you, Frotastic. I hope your gold dragon has a big fro. That's all I got to say.
Fantastic. So for the meet today, I reached out to you, Greg, and I said, hey, what is a topic that you would like to discuss on dungeon mastering? And something that you brought up as something you've been thinking about a lot lately and something you have a passion on is this idea of running games in one world, the same world, but having multiple groups running through that world and their actions having consequences and impacts on the other groups that they're running the game through. So let's start talking about this whole idea. I think the first thing to talk about is what are the different methods of DMing that you can have for this type of games. Like it's a couple games, not a game that you're running. So what are the different methods? How can you do this?
I mean, it really goes down to your DM style. I mean, I think, you'd think that, it stands to reason that you would want to prepare a lot. Like as a dungeon master, you would want to have a complete background so that if the two groups are playing in the same, general area of a fantasy world, that you would really want that area fleshed out so that the fun improvisational parts would come from how you were taking the events that happened in one group and imparting that knowledge to what's happening with the other group. Assuming you have two. If you have multiple ones, then you're even more crazy than I thought.
Right. It's going to become even more difficult.
Yeah, but I think. I think dungeon masters who prepare a lot would do that, but I think there's also the argument to be made that you could also do it in an improvisational way, so that there's not, so you obviously prep and you understand the events that occurred in each session, but you don't necessarily have to, spend hours and hours writing down your notes and memorizing them. I feel like the broad strokes are what's more important and what people will remember. So, for example, that example I gave earlier of running two groups, we used the red box in 4th edition, which was the Nentir Vale, I believe, and I set it up that it was during an ice age. So it was the Nentir Vale. It had the same locations and basically used that map, but it was all under sheets of ice, essentially, and snowfall. So it was almost like it combined two ideas of mine. One was playing in a dark sun like apocalyptic campaign where the resources were really short. This idea of having the multiple parties going through the same thing. And the one event that really latched on to both groups was there was a goblins were attacking a village. I believe it was the village of Fallcrest. And I'd set up that as happening in one group, had learned that this was going to happen, and they ignored all my hooks, essentially.
Wait, players don't do that. Come on.
I had them, find out the evidence that there was a massive, goblin army. They saw the goblin army. I think they even interrogated one of the goblins to find out where they were going and what was going to happen. They had just come from the village of Fallcrest, and they decided to be like, well, we have this other hook where there's treasure in a cave to the north. Let's go do that. And that happened, and I was like, okay, well, and then the next, few sessions, I remember because the other group was a little bit farther away, and I was like, you see, smoke trails going up, in the distance about, 50 miles away. It's really hard, but everything is flat and clear, so the visibility was high. And then we never really touched on it again, and then the group that ended up going to the cave kind of petered out. Some people left, and we just didn't end up playing with that group anymore. But I was playing with the other group a little bit longer, and they returned to the city of the village of Fallcrest as a broken husk with goblins occupying it. And it wasn't. I think after one or two sessions, there was lots of stories evolved with them trying to save people who were in there or whatever. But I let it loose that the reason why this city is like this is because the other group totally abandoned this town, and they did that, and they were all like, what? Oh my gosh, that's what happened. Why did they do that? And they immediately left that session and went to go make fun of the other group, or those who were left from the other group, to be like, why did you do that? We're dealing with the consequences of your actions. So I think, basically you can do it in broad strokes, I think, is what is going to be most important, what's going to have the most impact. It doesn't necessarily have to have, every event that happens throughout the adventures has to impact the other groups, but larger ones should definitely have, tentpole events should be important, and everyone should experience, some impact from that. But then you can also weave in smaller things like, oh, that's the same bartender, did the same mannerisms with that group than he did with that group, but that kind of thing, I feel like is also really valid ways to do this too.
I think the way that you're talking about DMing this style is the way that most DMs that are going to try to do this or are doing this out there are going about it. We're talking about like you are the DM running through either your own homebrew world or an adventure that you have picked up, or through Forgotten Realms, an established world or whatever. And then you have multiple groups, 2, or like you said, if you're really crazy, more than 2.
Yeah.
Another way that I know that this can be done, and I think this is probably going to be the way that less people do it, just simply because it's harder, because you're bringing together more people in one place at one time in the collaboration. But I did for a Catacon, when me and one of our other co-hosts, DM Chris, went to a Catacon, we did 2 games at 2 different tables with 2 different groups, but we decided that we were going to be in the same world at the same time. And so what we would do is both groups knew that this was going to be the case. And so what we would do is, like, every now and then we'd call a little bit of a break. Me and Chris would get together and just check up on each other and say, where's your group at? What's happening with this group? And eventually it led into the 2 groups at the end of the game, like, meeting up.
Ooh, cool.
But like it was pretty sweet, because the other group would do something, and even if we didn't like schedule a meeting, I'd have to be like, hey, my group just did something. I'd be like, hold on, guys. And I just walk over to the other table and tell Chris, hey, so they just did this. Your characters are probably going to notice what they just did. Like, it's going to have impact on their world. And it was pretty cool, but I imagine that would be pretty difficult to do, rather than a one-shot at a convention where everybody's there on a regular basis with another DM, and 2 groups getting together on the same night. And just in the fact that you need a lot of space to do that in general, but
Right.
But that's definitely another way that people can try.
I like that. I like that in a convention play.
That's my experience with it as well. That's my main experience, is being at a local gaming store, and it was right when 5th edition was going to come out, and essentially 3 groups went into a dungeon at the exact same time.
Man.
And there was one person designated at each table that could write down notes and communicate with the other, like, selected person at the other tables. So, like, I could write a note, and then they would hand it to either table 2 or 3, and they could read it, and then they would have to relay to their group, and they could message me back, kind of thing. But yeah, the orchestration on that,
it takes a lot of work.
Yeah. Yeah. And I started really thinking about this again because of 2 people I spoke to on the podcast for Dragon Talk. One was Ben Cameron, who is kind of living the dream as being a professional dungeon master to groups of people here in Seattle. And when we asked him to be on the podcast, that was the main reason. But in speaking to him, I realized that he has been doing this for like the last 3 or 4 years. He has separate groups running in the same world and impacting, each other. And he has, he's got a huge it's like the methodology that he's able to spout out about his homebrew world is really intense and amazing. Almost to the level of like he's memorized it and feels it from the core of his soul. So that was really impressive to me, and I was like, wow. I mean, I really thought about this idea a lot. I was like, one of the things that really I loved about Dungeons and Dragons when I was a kid, again fascinated with it, was something that MMOs really the idea of an MMO being like, here you're in a shared universe with a whole bunch of different people and you're telling these stories together. And of course, MMOs aren't really like that anymore. It's much more of a, hey, you're playing by yourself and there's some other people around and you can group up sometimes. But back in the 90s, when there was that promise of living in a virtual world, was really high for me. And I thought Dungeons and Dragons would do that too. And it never really coalesced into that other life kind of feel, right? But what Ben Cameron was able to do does feel like that, where it's like, oh, okay, like there actually are consequences and stories and things that really matter across multiple people. Not just the people at your table, but the people that Ben plays with on Tuesday nights, and those people. And like, so it is this really shared storytelling idea that gets at the core of what I love about Dungeons and Dragons. It's really cool. And then there was another guy who he's been running the same campaign for 34 years in a similar kind of thing where people have gone in and out of the campaign. So it's not always the same people. But he said he's had up to like 40 players being in the same world forever. And he's been playing it for 34 years, and he's like, they don't even really understand what the major threat of this campaign world is yet. And I was like, what?
They haven't
Okay,
even
that's
scratched
insane.
the surface.
Yeah. People can do it, and it's really interesting to me when they do, because of and you can do it in these long format, kind of things. It doesn't necessarily need to be at a convention. Although I do like the fun of that being in a convention setting, and that taps into something that one of my I used to write some RPG material for Goodman Games, and one of my co-writers was in that first group I played with in New York. His name's Tavis Allison. He really loved the idea of that multiple parties going through the same dungeon idea that you guys were just talking about doing in that one thing. And it is a bit of a D&D trope that we're like, that when you're going through a dungeon, there's evidence that other people have been there before. You've even just, that idea in like Indiana Jones where, he's seen the evidence of people who have sprung the traps from beforehand. You can have it on that smaller scale of it being just in an area and seeing the different groups trying to compete to get to the end and get the treasure before the other people do, or you can figure out ways for them to work together.
Well, one thing that you said when you were talking about Ben Cameron that kind of like stuck with me was you were basically talking about what he does, and you said it's really impressive. And I think the reason why you would describe it as really impressive and why most people who understand dungeon mastering in general would describe what Ben Cameron's doing as really impressive is because this whole idea that we're talking about, it's definitely, I wouldn't describe it as an easy one. Like this is something that brings along, I think, a lot of difficulties to it. And so maybe if we can just like talk a little bit about what those difficulties might be and ways that we as DMs can overcome and prepare for difficulties that might come along with this type of DMing.
Number one is definitely the minor and cat herding that you get when you're trying to wrangle all your players together in the first place.
Oh, yeah, like scheduling and stuff.
And then you're going to do that twice over, if not more. Because I feel like a lot of people that are going to get into this scenario are kind of like you had mentioned, Greg, earlier. Hey, who wants to play D&D? 15 of you want to play D&D. Okay. And then trying to figure out who's really interested. And even half that is 7 or 8, and that's still 2 groups. Yeah, scheduling, I think, would be at the top.
That would definitely be hard. You kind of need to have like you said, a group of people who are committed to doing not only playing on a weekly session, but being like, hey, this is not just a drop in once a month if you can. Like, you need to kind of be invested in this world. But I also think that this might increase players' investment a little bit. Like if there is, and maybe the best way to do it would be to make sure there was an out of game component where people could continue, like, by using Obsidian Portal or one of the other tools that allow people to communicate when they're not playing and see the impact of what their actions were and continue to be invested in it. Because it is going to be definitely harder, but there's a more reward to this style of play.
Yeah, and I think maybe part of that is just making sure that whatever type of game that you're running doesn't rely on the fact that every single person has to be at every single game every time. So if somebody does drop out, like I know for a lot of campaigns that I run, I'm doing like a very linear but loose like storyline, but there is like an overarching plot. And like, so when a player can't show up for me with a group of 4 or 5, I just say, you know what, it's board game night tonight, guys, because I don't want to play through the important stuff that we're going into without that person and that PC. But I think if you're doing that with multiple groups that may be impacting each other and changing each group's play, you want to play in a game, in a world, in an adventure that if somebody says, hey, I can't come this week, you can just say, all right, well, you'll be missed, but we're going to continue.
The other thing to keep in mind, which you just reminded me, was that linear storytelling with one clear villain probably isn't the best story for this kind of style. Like, I don't think Curse of Strahd, for example, may not be the best thing that you'd want to choose for this. But maybe not. Actually, no, now I kind of take that back because a lot of what we did with that adventure was creating a sandbox around Barovia. oh, now I'm actually thinking about like, what if Strahd was able to
now
play
you're
the
thinking
groups?
it will be a great idea, huh?
Yeah, playing the groups off each other as the evil villain of Strahd would be a lot of fun. Well, all right, well, but you know what I'm trying to say is like you need something that is where there's things that each group is able to do in the world that would feel like they have impact. So it does not lend itself to a completely linear, like you need to resolve everything at this location before you go on to the next location kind of style of campaign. You need to make it feel way more sandboxy. Because that's part of the fun is that they get to choose where they go and what they do. Then impart that those events and what happened to them to the other group, so that if they show up to one of those locations, they can be like, oh, well, this is already looted, or this, the mayor of this town was already deposed because he was corrupt, or that kind of thing.
Yeah, and kind of piggybacking off of that, whether you're going to run like a linear storyline or linear for each group, so maybe they're both going through different plots that will lead them into the same place or whatever it is, or if you're doing sandbox, I think something that you need to think about is like the time frame for each group. So like when you get together on Thursday to play with group A, are they going to be playing at the same time in your world as when you meet on Friday with Group B? And if that is the case, like what happens if Group A goes to the same exact town with Group B? What do you do in that situation where you don't have the players all one spot, but the PCs would meet up? I think these are things you have to think through.
Yeah.
And maybe that's some reason for you to say each group is going to be separated by a week's time or something along those lines, so that Group A affected the world this way and they are somewhere else than Group B is going to be. Of course, there still is difficulty in that, because if Group B says, hey, we want to in the sandbox campaign go to the town that Group A is in, you got to figure something out for that. But that's definitely a difficulty that you want to at least prepare for and think for and go, how am I going to DM if this happens?
Instead of trying to avoid that, I think I would try to encourage that as a DM. I would want them to be in the same general area, not necessarily, it would definitely be difficult to pull off, but I mean, it's part of that connection that makes it really interesting, so maybe, like if one group A was going and they came to a tavern in the same town where Group B was, I would describe those characters as being in the tavern, and this is the other group and this is what they're doing, and try to do a good job of, as a DM, of portraying them the way that the players in Group B portray them, so that they have a sense of like, oh yeah, these are them and we know them. Maybe if you know that it's going to happen ahead of time, or you have an inkling, you can ask a player from Group B to guest,
to join,
and to show up and then play that part and be there, and then go off and do its thing. I think as we said, the scheduling of all of those groups together at the same time might not be worth it for a chance meeting. It would be worth it if it was a planned
big event,
assault on a dragon or something, right? That would be fun to get everybody together, or at least try to get everybody together.
As long as you have mature players that aren't going to go, oh, I know that's the other PC, let's pick a fight with them.
Yeah, but then even then, like I would play that out. I mean, what would happen?
Yeah,
I think that's the fun of a sandbox campaign, is like, I think you have to be okay with them making bad choices, and part of the fun is, what are the consequences of those choices? It doesn't just impact you; it impacts everybody who's in this shared world.
So, Greg, I'm gonna keep asking you. I'm gonna keep drilling you about this, because I'm thinking of concerns, and I'd love to hear like what your thoughts are. So, what if that happens with a DM and they allow there to be the PCs from the other group? They meet up, and let's say, whether there is a really good reason for it, or it's just a player who is that kind of goofy player that's like, I want to fight these guys, and they get in a fight. And what if one of those PCs, like, it goes to zero? How would you handle that?
Well, that is a very good question. I think I would attempt to play it out as much as the way it would happen if those players were there. So if there is a peacemaker in Group B, I would use that PC's abilities or whatever to try and stop the fight, just as they would if they were there.
Yeah.
Kind of thing, the worst case scenario that you're really asking about is like, what if one player kills another player
Exactly,
off
and the player's
screen?
not there. Yeah,
Yeah, and you have to show up and be like, oh, by the way, player A
your character's
killed
dead.
player
Sorry,
B.
buddy.
Sorry,
But I didn't
just
do
deal with it.
anything.
Because that's a horrible thing. You don't want to ever say
Yep.
that to someone.
Nope.
So I would try to figure out a way in game to control that as much as possible. And then if none of that worked, I think I would do some Deus Ex Machina kind of thing, probably, of like, a big bad shows up in the middle of the fight and they all have to join together and fight.
Work together,
or,
yeah.
The mayor or the sheriff comes in and arrests one of them or something, like, and that person is in jail. And then instead of player A killing player B, player A, has to start the next session in jail, or maybe player B is also in jail and they're in 2 cells next to each other, and then they have to talk through their differences or something like that. I don't know, some way where like it doesn't just get hand waved and be like, no, you can't do that.
Yeah, I think that like you use the word Deus Ex Machina, and I think that a lot of players out there like hear that and I think they cringe at that, but I think that in this sense, like it's a really good thing, because not only are you protecting the players that aren't there and their characters, but you're also saying to the players that are doing this, everybody's PCs are important to me, in the sense of like, I'm not going to allow you to kill these PCs without the players being here, and I would do the same thing for you guys. I mean, allowing that to happen and getting up to that point, that will become a really important and interesting event when you get back to Group A and say, hey, by the way, this is what happened to your characters. You were brought to the brink of death by this character. Yeah. This character is now in jail. You probably hate this character from the other group now. Like, what do you do about this? It brings up really interesting story hooks and everything.
Yeah, and what better way to create a rivalry between the two parties?
Yeah, absolutely.
And then so then as the DM, you're like, well, I didn't even do that. They did that, and I'm just working into the story. So like, all right, instead of this being like a story about 2 groups of adventurers working together, let's figure out how they can compete, and I think that you're right, that like changes the story completely, but I think it would be satisfying for everybody.
Yeah, that was my question initially, was that not that it's happenstance, but that it's almost clandestine, that you have 2 parties that start out, one good, one evil. I mean, obviously that's very black and white, but helps the conversation, and eventually they will come to a head. And for me personally, I'm trying to figure out like how high should the stakes be for 2 long-running campaigns once they run into each other. Because obviously people get really attached to the characters, and you could definitely go the Deus Ex Machina road, even if they're good and evil. Something more evil could show up and want to get them all. But
maybe it's something that completely nobody understands. Like, what if all of a sudden time stops in the middle of a punch? And nobody knows why, and they have to break out of it. I see it as an opportunity to add more hooks instead of it taking away hooks, honestly.
Yeah.
Instead of it being a problem, it's just, it's good to think through these things and not get caught off guard and go, oh no, like what do I have to do here? I have to like say, we're going to rewind. We're going to like pretend that I never did that. Like just even if you need to take a second as DM and go, guys, give me a second. I got to think about what's going to happen here. Yep. Like, I think just like, that's okay. Like, that's okay to do that every now and then. Like,
absolutely.
That's a classic time for a bathroom break.
Yeah.
Like, oh, guys, don't mind
I really
me.
have to pee.
I've just got all my books with me. No worries. I'll be back in like a half hour. Don't worry about it.
I'm just going to take my notebook to the bathroom.
The other thing I wanted to mention, and kind of what you were talking about as far as like there being a time difference and stuff, as one possible solution to this, timekeeping actually does become way more important. I don't know about you as a DM, but I don't necessarily, it depends on the thing. Like when I was running the Out of the Abyss campaign, I was definitely keeping track of days a little bit more. But if it doesn't matter, it's very easy to be like, oh, I don't know, a week has passed. Like
you don't normally keep the game calendar right by your side and go, oh, I know that it is this date at this time. Like, it's not something normally in campaigns that I think we focus on.
But I think in this style of a campaign, you really need to do that. You really need to know what day things happened. Not necessarily to show to the players, but just so in your own head, the timeline of events in this world. Because you're the only one as a dungeon master who's able to do that. In this, you are, I mean, you really do become, multiple shards of reality juggling in your head. And so anyway, I mean, I'm a terrible note taker as a DM. I wouldn't say that's my strength at all. But in this, I would force myself to do it and write it down so that you know exactly when things occurred. Yeah, I just think that's going to be a breaking point for a lot of stuff, especially if you start to get things wrong too often. Then the whole image of what you're trying to create shatters for your players.
It's good to take notes in general, but this is a really important time to take.
Right, like
notes
even if you
for your
don't take
campaigns.
take notes about this. Is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, because you can see how far apart they get too, which was another concern I had about time. Like if you have like a magic heavy group and they're just like lightning bolt, lightning bolt, lightning bolt, long rest.
Yeah.
And then essentially their timeline just starts edging out farther and farther, whereas the second group might be more martial based and they don't really have casters, so they just keep pushing ahead. And it's taking, and the timelines are splitting apart, and trying to be aware of that, because they could easily end up weeks apart if you're not paying attention.
Yeah, especially if people like spellcasters do downtime of researching spells or that kind of thing. That can build up over time.
So when you talk about worlds, this world that you're playing in, you have multiple groups. I think one of the objectives, at least I would have as a DM, is I would love to have eventually both teams like meet up at some point, if not multiple points. And I think that raises the question of, are you working with this game and these multiple games towards these groups working towards teamwork? Maybe they go after like a big bad or whatever it is together, or is it a competition that they are working against each other in the same world for opposite goals? And so what are you guys' thoughts on that? Like, how do you determine that? What are some ideas that you can work towards with that?
I don't know if I would want to set it up ahead of time. I think that's the takeaway I have from that question, is where I don't want to necessarily be latched onto, okay, even just in talking about this, being like, and you guys are working together to do X. Like, I would say, like, you're just in the same world. This touches on like a lot of what we've already discussed, and just let the events of what the party does kind of dictate the flavor of that. So, in our example of one character attacking another character, like, all right, well, that's, like I said, it pretty much sets up this being a rivalry, and maybe even a redemption kind of story, where like they learn that they have to team up in order to do it, but it comes from an animosity between the two groups. Or if they seem to work together well, and whenever there's mention of the other group, the other group seems fascinated, wants to connect, and actually actively works towards meeting up with this other group, then I would say, like, all right, well, you guys are two arms of, maybe they have the same patron, maybe they all fall under the same king or prince or queen who's giving them missions in order to save the kingdom, and so they're all working under the same group, and there might be some friendly competition there. But so again, I would dictate it based on what the players want and do.
Yeah, I think it's going to be super dependent on the players, because do you have two groups that essentially already know each other, and then that could immediately dictate which way that goes, because it could immediately mean they want to work together or that they don't, or it could just be two groups that essentially don't know each other. Going back to your scenario, Greg, where 15 people say yes, and just because they all work at the same place doesn't inherently mean that they know each other. So you could have two groups that essentially, that is like the journey is better than the destination kind of thing, where they're figuring out would I interact with these other groups. Yeah, I think you almost have to let it dictate, but you can push it one way or the other depending on how heavy-handed you want to be about the big bad evil, because I totally did research while we were talking. It was called Vault of the Dracolich. That's the thing that I played in, where it was 3 groups and we all were trying to get to and stop the Dracolich from rising and killing everyone. You could always throw one of those in there.
Yeah.
It'll make teamwork will make the dream work, I'm sure, at that point.
There you go.
One idea that just came to my head as you were talking, Neal, was what if, we're kind of thinking about these as equal groups, but what if they're not? What if you have a group that's, 10th, 11th, 12th level, and you wanted to start a new group at level 1? And these guys are kind of like the like literally the B team. Like, they are younger, they're less experienced, and it's actually the members of the group A that are sending them out on missions to go do stuff and trying to prove their worth. And maybe they're, one of them I'm going on a whole bunch of fantasy tropes here, but like one of them is like the son of one of the other people, or their daughter, or and trying to take on that mantle, and maybe even have players who are playing in both groups as different characters. I think those are other possibilities for this as well. So you don't have to worry too much about, like if you have one player who's like, hey, I want to play more than one session a week. Here's a great way to do it, is actually just to add in, if you have a couple of newbies who haven't played before, to be interested, be like, here's a great way. You can play with an experienced player. The experienced player is getting something new out of the game that he may not have gotten before, or she may not have gotten before. And, I don't know. I think that's just another scenario that you can work with.
And that can lead to like even guest, like you were talking about before, guest appearances for like different reasons. I think when you brought up like the idea of like a son and a father PCs in different groups, like my immediate thought was, well, what if one of them dies? Like they're going to want to go to that person and like hold some sort of funeral, and that's a way you can have like a guest appearance for that night. Like he joined the group for that night because he's going to want to be there to like send his father or his son, whatever it is, into the afterlife with an appropriate like funeral. Like that sounds like a great hook there.
That sounds fantastic.
Yeah, and one thing I also thought of was we talked about like bringing the teams together for like teamwork against a big bad or whatever it is. I thought of your original story about the goblins that attacked the town. It might not even be something planned, but it might be like this Group B comes along and finds out that it is because Group A and their negligence that this town was attacked by goblins. Well, hopefully they're going to like say, well, like if they're mad about it, they might try to take back the town, whatever it is. But that might lead to, well, their negligence has made them rivals because they're like, how dare they just pass us on by? It's because of them. We need to go. We have a bone to pick with that group now. So we are going to travel to meet that group with the intentions that we're going to bring them to their knees. And then you bring them together and have that confrontation happen.
Oh, that's so cool. Like what if like, and one of them is a cleric of the god of justice and is actually acting as magistrate and being like, I need to bring these people to justice.
Oh man, that's great.
And like actually you can have
and
like a
has
trial.
Actual power in the world. Yeah. And has actual like authority to do so.
Yeah.
Like, do those other players then become rogues? Do they repent for their actions? How does that play out? And not being like, oh, I'm the DM with the NPCs that are throwing this at them, but now you have players at a table running PCs with these really heavy issues and like working through it and maybe coming to blows over it. But that's just great storytelling that you as the DM can almost sit back and just allow to happen.
Yeah, right. Okay, you guys, all right, you have your trial. I'll just be over here.
Talk it out amongst yourselves.
Yeah, that's amazing. I thought you were going to go somewhere different with the goblin attack, but it was another we're just throwing out crazy ideas at this point. But, a mass combat or a battle scene in which both groups are participating would be a really great way to kind of do it. It'd be a fun, different setup than a dungeon crawl, but like you'd have one player group leading like the vanguard, for example, and another player group is leading the the artillery if they're like all spellcasters or something like that. Like have it actually play out a little bit as a real battle would in a multiple setting. That could be a good climactic bit. It could be the start of the campaign. Maybe that's where it all happened and everybody else in the army dies or is decimated, and these are the two groups of people that are left alive, and then they have a schism and they split up and then try to figure out what to do. I don't know. There's just so many great ways that I think all of us are latching onto the storytelling possibilities here.
So, Greg, if our listeners wanted to get in touch with you or see what you've got going on, where would they go to do that?
I think you guys want to know where to follow me on Twitter, which is @Greg Tito. Very simple. Ask me anything you want about the podcast, about Dungeons & Dragons in general, or DMing. I love, as you can tell, coming up with weird, crazy story ideas and hopefully finding some time to actually play them out at some point. But then, of course, dungeonsanddragons.com is where you can find out all about our later releases. We have Storm King's Thunder is out now. It's a very cool campaign that deals with the ordning of the giant types being smashed and the small folk, the humans, half-elves, only half-elves, not the real elves, fighting against them and trying to figure out what's going on. And then, of course, Volo's Guide to Monsters is coming out very soon. In friendly local game stores. There's an alternate cover that is only going to be available to game stores. It's designed by Hydro74, this artist out of southern Florida, and it's awesome. I've seen the cover. I've touched it. It is totally different than
It is real.
The glossy feel that a lot of our other D&D books. It's got like a kind of a soft matte finish. Great art of a mind flayer on the front. So go ahead, check that out in your store. It should be out November 4th.
Oh, you had me at Mind Flayer.
Yep. I've seen a picture online. It looks amazing.
It's so good.
So thank you so much, Greg, for joining us on the Dungeon Masters block. We really appreciate your time and just your efforts, and we appreciate what you do for Wizards of the Coast and for D&D.
Thanks, man.
So just thank you so much.
No problem. And I feel like I would be remiss if I didn't mention those specific 2 episodes of Dragon Talk that I referenced a bunch of times. So go check that out. It's the longest D&D campaign ever was the episode with Robert Warbaugh, who ran the campaign for 34 years, or is still running the campaign for 34 years. And then just recently we spoke to Ben Cameron about dungeon mastering birthday parties. So if you're interested in more, I mean, these guys have been doing it way more than I have. So if on this topic specifically, go listen to those episodes, and you'll get a lot more insight from people that have been doing it for a long time.
Definitely go check those out.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah, we just want to thank Greg Tito again for joining us, and we hope that you guys enjoyed our discussion on One World, Multiple Impacts. If you want to get in touch with us, you can always email us at dungeonmasterblock@gmail.com. And if you like the show, you should definitely head over, no matter what country you're in, because we'll find you eventually, to iTunes and give us a 5-star review, and you'll get a shout out on the podcast.
You can follow us on Twitter at DMS_block. That's at DMsBlock. You can like our Facebook page. If you go and do either of that, you're going to get updates about the show, who's coming on. You're going to get D&D memes and just D&D goodness all around. We have a Patreon member shout out of the week, and this week's Patreon member shout out goes to Will B. Thank you so much, Will B. Will B is a silver dragon, so he is on our forums. He's got our bonus pods. He is able to give us input into the future of our show. So thank you for your support so much.
And definitely, if you're not on the forums in the right place, just let us know and we'll fix it.
We will. Just send me or Neil a message.
As always, this podcast is part of the Block Party Podcast Network. Check out some of the other shows on the network, like the GM Showcase, Story Arc, and of course, We're So Bad at Adventuring. And that's all we have for you today on the Dungeon Master's Block, the place where we talk about the Dungeon Master, the most important person in the game, the only person capable of playing God,
killing characters,
and lowering the egos of everyone else at the table. Au revoir, everyone.
Keep on dungeon mastering.
Yes! I googled how to say things in a different language. Alright, and with that, we will shut down the lights, turn off the computers, and do everything else that comes with not doing a podcast. That was weird. I don't want to do that.
Great blooper, though. That was weird. Not doing that.
Yep, and with that, we're going to shut off the lights, turn off the computers, and head home. But I'm already home, so I'm there. Thanks for listening to Dungeon Master's Block. I don't know, you didn't write it, so then I got confused too.
This is the best. This is the best.
Goodbye.